Section 3 of this CAD tutorial, where we're drawing a bike, we're going to focus on the wheels. So step 1 is to create a new layer and call it wheels. Obviously we're going to draw our wheels on that layer. So you see I have added a new layer, I've called it wheels, and I've focused in on one of the wheels that I'm going to draw. Now we're going to use the copy tool to draw one wheel and then simply copy the second one, so we don't need to go through this whole process twice. But what we are going to do is start by creating 3 lines. The first line will be the outside of our wheel, and this is the line or the circle we already have created. And then I'm going to put a vertical line from the center straight up and use that vertical end point here as my center point for my wheel. And I'm going to draw 2 other layers that are going to represent the inside and outside of the rim. So let's get started with that. Excuse me. So I'm going to add an object, and the object I'm going to add is going to be a line. And I want to make sure I turn on my center point snap so that I can get this line starting from the center of my wheel. I hold down my shift key, and I'm going to draw that line straight up past the edge of the outer tire. So holding down your shift key ensures that that line will stay straight. So now I can also use that end point of that line as the center of my circle. And all of the circles I will draw here will have the exact same center point, and that is very important. Alright, so I'm going to draw another circle now. And again, I'm not measuring any of these. I'm just going to go to my end point snap now, right there. And I'll draw out another line, and this would be the outside of my rim, this part here being the rubber tire. And I will draw one more line, one more circle line, all the way out. And that is the inside of my rim. So I'll flip back to my instructions, and you see we have our outer wheel and our outer rim and our inner rim. So we move down to the next component, or the next step, and that is to identify the spoke pattern that exists on your particular bicycle. Now, on the bicycle I drew, I identified this pattern, and this is a grouping of 4 spokes that you see repeats over and over and over 8 times to complete the full 360 degrees of the rim. A lot of the bicycles that you're going to find are going to have a standard spoke pattern like this. It may be slightly different, but your job then is to identify the small grouping that gets repeated over and over. So when I look at this grouping here, number 1, I see 2 lines that are parallel to each other and just run in towards the center hub of the wheel. And then I see 2 more spokes outside of that that run out on a slight angle. So we have angle, straight, straight, angle, and then we have that same pattern repeated over and over. Angle, straight, straight, angle, and then there is a repeated pattern of 8 of that section. So the first thing I want to do is draw this first section that I've seen, but I'm going to draw it straight up and down, and that's just a little bit easier in terms of aligning your bits and pieces. So I am going to draw that pattern. I've got my center line, so I'm going to start from somewhere near the center and draw a line straight up. And notice I'm drawing it past the edge of the tire. I'm going to trim off the pieces I don't need when I'm done. So that's one straight one, and right beside that, if I turn off my snap tool, I'm going to draw another one on a slight angle. So I've got these 2 lines now on this side of that center, so I'm going to use the mirror tool to duplicate these and flip them over to the other side so I have everything symmetrical left and right. So I'm going to select one object. I'm going to hold down my shift key and select the second object. I'm then going to choose mirror, and it asks me for a base point. So I'm simply going to make sure my end point snap is turned on, click on the end of this line, and then click on the end of that line at the other side. Now notice I have end point still on, and I'm going to hit enter. So now I have 1, 2, 3, 4 spokes. So this line that's right down the middle is not one of my spokes, but I'm going to do one more thing before I get rid of that line, and that is to draw a circle from that end point, making sure my end point snap is turned on. I'm going to draw that circle just a little bit bigger than the end point I have for all of my spoke endings, because everything inside here is going to be trimmed at some point, and I want this to be a nice neat area, and this is also centered in my circle, so everything in here will disappear. Everything out here will be my spokes. Now, before I actually go ahead and duplicate this around in a circular pattern, I'm going to give them a little bit of thickness. I don't want my spokes to be one straight simple line, so I'm going to duplicate them or offset them. We have used the offset tool before, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And I'm going to offset these with a very small distance. I think it says use a distance of 0.1. Now, when I give you distances in my tutorial, I'm assuming you have your page set up exactly like mine. If the distances I give you don't work, obviously you can change the distances to something that does work for you. So I'm going to select this spoke, and I'm going to choose offset, and I'm going to choose a distance. I'm going to try 0.1. I want something quite small. And I'm going to offset that to the inside. And there you see that worked out quite well for the scale of my drawing. So I'm going to do the same thing with this one. I'm going to select it. I'm going to choose offset, a distance of 0.1, and I'm going to offset it to the middle towards this center line. And I'll do the same with the next two. Now, if you want to, you can do obviously the offset first and then the duplication or the mirror. It's up to you. I guess if you're watching this video, you're following what I'm doing. So I'm going to choose this object, distance of 0.1, and I'll offset it to the inside. And then I'll choose this object, offset, distance of 0.1, and I will bring it again to the inside. So there you have my spoke setup. Now, before I do any duplication or arraying of this setup, I'm going to get rid of the pieces I don't want. So I'm going to trim. So I select trim, I hit enter, and now I simply click on the lines that I want to disappear. So I'm going to get rid of the long ends. And when you are trimming, it makes sense to start further away from the end point of your trim. If I start trimming here and going this way, it's not going to allow me to complete my trim because I'm going to be left with bits of line that are floating by themselves. So I will continue to trim, zoom in a little bit, and I also want to trim these parts in here. Oh, I don't want to get rid of that one. So I made a little mistake there, so I'm going to start my trim again. Trim, enter. Okay, so if I'm not getting a good enough view there, I need to zoom in again to do my trim accurately. Trim, enter. Now I should be able to properly get the pieces I want. And I'm also going to continue with this trim right in here, because I don't want all of these lines creating a massive mess inside this inner hub of my wheel. Okay, so I'll zoom back out a little bit so I can see more or less my entire wheel. Okay, so now it's time for me to take a look at the multiple sets of spokes that I have. But I can see here that I have 8 of them that I need to duplicate. So my next step here, I've gone through, didn't look at my instructions here, I've gone through my offset, I've gone through my trimming, so I'm now at this point in my tutorial. So now we're ready to use the polar array tool, and the polar array tool will take me from this to this by duplicating this grouping all the way around. Okay, so time to do an array, and I guess I want to get rid of this one before I do my array. So here is my polar array tool. So I'm going to select these spokes. I'm going to use my polar array. Now I have some settings that I can adjust here. So it says please select the center point. So I want that point in there that's the center of my circle. So I am going to choose center point. There we go. I'm going to click there. Now we're going to choose the option based on total number and angle covered. So number of items. So I've counted that there are 8 groupings within the view that I've seen, and I want to circle that 8 through a full 360 degrees. I want to rotate the items as I go. You'll notice if you don't turn rotate on, it's just a mess of spokes. And when I'm happy with that, I click OK. And there's what you end up with. So what a polar array is a repeated pattern of something in a circular formation. So there's the first grouping I've created, and I ran them all the way around to give me my wheel. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video there. Actually, let's just jump back and see what the next step is. So I've created my polar array. Oh yeah, okay, one more step. I'm going to put some treads on that tire, and this is a real simple process, not very difficult at all. So I'm going to zoom in so I can see the top part of that. I'm going to quickly draw my center line back in again. Hold down my shift. And the reason I did that is because I want to start my tread right here. And this isn't super scientific, but what I'm simply going to do is draw a little rectangle right there, and I'm going to trim away any of the parts below the edge of the wheel. And then I'm going to array that all the way around my wheel. So I will do the same thing that I did before. I'm going to select that triangle or that rectangle component, that part of a rectangle. I will choose polar array. It asks me for a center point, so I'm going to use the end point of this line. Same settings I had before, total number of items. Now this is a complete guess. I don't know how many treads I want, but as you can see in the background here, it shows me how many I'm getting. So let's try 25. That looks okay. What if I go to 30? That looks better. And angle to cover, I want a full 360. So I will say okay. There is my outer tread. Now I'm going to do the same thing or something very similar for my inner tread. I'm going to draw another one right here. This time I'm going to zoom in a little bit more on it, and I'm going to rotate it. And I'm doing that because I want this tread to be offset slightly from this one. I don't want it to be right underneath this one. So I'll select that. I'm going to rotate. It asks me for a base point, so I can click anywhere in or around that. It really doesn't matter. And as I move my handle off, with my snap to grid turned off, you can see that I can rotate this around. And I'm going to pick a spot, say somewhere around there. And then what I'm going to do is draw a line just across my tread to do the same thing we did at the top. I'm going to trim the bottom section of this away. So I choose trim, hit enter, and I get rid of the bottom components. And then I will simply delete that bottom line I used. And I'm going to now array that same with the same format. I need to move a little bit so I can get my center line. Zoom back out a little bit also. There we go. All right, so I need my center point, so end point, I'll use the end of that line. I'm going to go with a few less this time. Let's go with 25 just to space them out slightly differently. Through a full 360 degrees, and I will say OK. So there we now have my wheel with the array of the spokes and the little knobby rubber parts on my tire to give my tire some traction. So it looks like I'm drawing a mountain bike here, slightly thicker tire, but everything else is ready to go. So I'm going to erase this line because I don't need it anymore. And then to move on in the instructions, you can simply duplicate that wheel to give you a second wheel. Now make sure you do get them centered appropriately on your frame. You can use your shift when you copy them, line them up so they are lined up with each other, and the next video tutorial will show you how to use the polar array again to create some sprockets. All right, good luck with that. If you have any questions, let me know.